with Lynda Kinkade.
We begin in Gaza, where the Israeli military is pounding the city ahead of a ground offensive. On Monday, the IDF launched an airstrike on the tallest building in the enclave. CNN has recorded the destruction of at least a dozen high-rise buildings in central Gaza since early September. The U.S. Secretary of State met with the Israeli Prime Minister on Monday. Sources tell CNN that Marco Rubio told Netanyahu that Israel has the full support of the U.S. for the assault on Gaza City, but stressed the operation should move quickly. Well, U.S. President Trump is warning Hamas that all bets are off if they use hostages as human shields. Hamas says the fate of the hostages lies in the hands of the Netanyahu government. More than 10% of Gaza's population have been killed or injured since the war began. That's according to a former Israeli military chief who oversaw the first 17 months of conflict. That number is expected to rise when Israel launches its ground invasion of Gaza City. CNN's Jeremy Diamond has more. We need to warn you, some of the images in this report are disturbing.
Gaza City trembles with each new blast. Lately, its residents have faced one strike after another. The reality on the ground is even more terrifying. Bloodied and shaken, the injured are rushed out amid swirls of smoke and ash. Wounded children carried once again into hospitals ill-equipped to handle the rising tide of casualties that accompanies Israel's intensifying bombardment of Gaza City. More than 140 were killed here over the weekend, according to local hospitals. A wave of attacks that shook many here into fleeing the city. Sleepy children bundled into their parents' arms, essential belongings lugged by those forced to move once again. At daybreak, their numbers multiply. A mass exodus on a scale not seen in Gaza in many months. More than 100,000 people were displaced this weekend alone, according to Israeli military estimates. I'm coming from death, indiscriminate bombardments, martyrs in the streets, Mohammed says. It is a miracle we survived. Old and young press south towards an uncertain future. Those who can afford it pay to ride on top of trucks and trailers. For many here, this is not a first. They have been forced to pile their entire lives on top of cars and makeshift carts before. They have already lost so much, and they are exhausted. This man says 25 of his relatives have already been killed. I left only for these children, but I wish a rocket would hit me and I die and find comfort because this is not life, he says, his frustration rising. The hundreds of thousands who still remain in Gaza City will face much more destruction and loss as Israel prepares to send ground forces into the city in the coming days. Ahmed is inconsolable as he walks amid the rubble of another Israeli strike. A military evacuation order allowed him to escape with his life, but little else. The house is gone. Where will we stay? He cries. But he won't find any answers here. And so many others are asking themselves the same question. Jeremy Diamond, CNN, Jerusalem.
Well, joining me now is CNN military analyst and retired U.S. Air Force Colonel Cedric Leighton. Great to have you on the program, Colonel. I want to start with the escalation of attacks because there's so much debate over whether the offensive to seize control of Gaza City has officially begun. And if it hasn't yet, what key changes should we expect once it does?
Yeah, Lynda, good to be with you. One of the key things to look for, I think, is the intensity of the activities. So we've already seen a lot of aerial activity. That may increase in intensity as this offensive moves forward. Of course, we'll also be seeing ground movements, and I would expect to see armored personnel carriers, tanks, things like that, vehicles like that, that the IDF would be using in order to move into the main part of Gaza City. They are going going to really have to find a way to work their way through the rubble. They're going to have to find their way to work through some of the tunnels that are still left by Hamas, that Hamas is still manning, at the moment. Of course, they've destroyed a lot of the high rises, and that's going to be, one of the key things to look at, even further destruction and, of course, movements of troops, probably from several directions in and around Gaza City. I would expect them to come from the east, the north, and the south, and that would then be a key indicator that this offensive has actually begun.
The U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is in Israel, offering strong U.S. support to Prime Minister Netanyahu's objective of dismantling Hamas. Given the enormous humanitarian cost already and the possibility of new radicalized groups emerging, what strategies should Israel and the international community consider to ensure long-term stability in Gaza?
Well, I think this type of operation is definitely not the way to go when it comes to ensuring some kind of a long-term strategy that would change the governance structure in Gaza and would also change the likelihood of further terrorists being born out of this absolute crisis. But what we'll really see, I think, in this particular case is once this invasion happens, it's going to be really incumbent upon the IDF to take care of the humanitarian situation that will undoubtedly get worse under these circumstances. And that's going to, I think, be very tough for them to do, because the IDF does have a humanitarian component to it, an organization that handles humanitarian issues, but it is not really set up to do this on as large a scale as will be necessary in this particular case. That would be one of the key elements of a strategy that would be necessary for this development to work in that way. But it is something that the Israelis, I think, are going to find difficult to actually execute.
And of course, Colonel, families of hostages have expressed frustration, saying Netanyahu has not done enough to prioritize their safe return. In light of this new offensive in Gaza City and the recent attack on Hamas negotiators in Doha, what are the potential risks and benefits of pursuing military objectives over diplomatic negotiations?
Yeah, there are a lot of risks in pursuing military objectives when it comes to hostages. There are, of course, ways in which you can free hostages using very precise, pinpoint military operations. But that's not what the Israelis are doing in this particular case. And Lynda, when you look at the types of forces that are going to be arrayed against positions in Gaza City, it really puts the hostages' lives, unfortunately, at risk. And it's going to basically be a miracle if these people survive, if the hostages survive, because the type of force that's going to be used is basically very blunt. It's blunt force. And when in this particular case, really precision efforts would be necessary in order to get the hostages out via military means. And even that would be extremely risky, especially given these circumstances.
Colonel Cedric Leighton, always great to get your analysis. Thanks so much for joining us.
You bet, Lynda.